Few titles can boast of having done better than Elden Ring. With more than 23 million sales today and 96 on Metacritic, the game is a worldwide success and one of the best in history, alongside other behemoths of the genre such as Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild. Despite being launched a week after Horizon Forbidden West, the sequel to PlayStation's new ultra-popular license, Hidetaka Miyazaki's game has completely rolled over the year 2022. Aloy instantly fell into oblivion, and God of War Ragnarok didn't stand a chance at the Game Awards. In fact, it's simple. As of February 2022, the whole world knew that Elden Ring would be crowned Game of the Year, but a question arises: how did Elden Ring manage to make popular one of the most hermetic formulas to the general public? How did Elden Ring manage to seduce so many new players by doing the opposite of what it is still done today? Sit comfortably. In this digital tales, we dissect FromSoftware's formula by going far, far back to find the 10 key dates that made it possible to concoct a recipe long refined, tested, improved, balanced in order to give birth to one of the greatest RPGs in history, and it all began in 1974. What could be more normal than to start our story with the birth of the man behind the growing success of FromSoftware? As you may have understood, Hidetaka is the man who propelled the studio to the top. He is at the origin of the Souls formula, and the studio's main big successes come straight out of his head. And anyway, a big part of this video will revolve around him simply because Miyazaki is above all a vision that we find in each of his games. You should know that his childhood shaped some of his future productions. It's a pattern that can be found in several successful designers, like Satoshi Tajiri, the father of Pokemon, who collected insects as a child, or Shigeru Miyamoto, who by dint of going for walks during his childhood ended up discovering a mysterious cave, sowing the idea of the Legend of Zelda in the back of his mind, an idea that would germinate years later. In Miyazaki's case, it is a game design idea specific to each of these games that he borrows from a childhood passion. Do you remember the books in which you are the hero? I remember having had a few of them in my childhood, and it was while digging into Miyazaki's life that I remembered their existence. It's a kind of role-playing book on paper where you have to make choices. Each choice takes you back to a specific situation. For example, an action A will take you to page 76, while action B will place the rest of your adventures on page 23. You shape your own adventure, you fight monsters with dice, you count your hit points and everything that goes with it. The problem was that at the time, a large majority of the books he read were in English. Miyazaki does not have a perfect command of this language, far from it in reality, and so he uses his own imagination to fill in the passages he does not understand. And now, if you've already played Dark Souls, Bloodborne, or the incredible Elden Ring, a little light may have just lit up in your head. Because, yes, the narrative is deliberately cryptic in all its games. History is not revealed directly, and in truth, it is not fully revealed at all. This is Miyazaki's own narrative, the environmental narrative. Basically, if you think that the story of the game will be revealed to you by great speeches with the characters or by cutscenes lasting several minutes, you are putting your finger in your eye and you may be disappointed. To understand the during the universes imagined by Miyazaki, you have to pay attention to the details, to the architecture of the areas. For example, the presence of a certain type of enemy in one area rather than another. It is important and everything is often justified. You will also have to take the time to read the few lines of description that will accompany absolutely all the objects in the game, from the most badass boss armor to the poorest little flower that we pick up by the dozen. If you play Dark Souls without paying attention to your surroundings or reading its descriptions, you won't understand anything, and it's probably the first experience that all players had before realizing the genius of the gentleman, pushing us to restart a run this time by playing totally differently. Even if it's just great to be able to make connections and understand the story of the game for yourself, gray areas remain, and Miyazaki has chosen to let the player's imagination work. Not all the answers will be given to you in these games, and it is up to each person to make up their own theory. Like a tribute to these imaginary adventures imagined in these books, of which you are the hero that he leafed through during his childhood. I already know that some of you will find it strange to have an entire point on a work that is not even a video game, But we simply can't talk about the Miyazaki recipe without talking about Berserk. It's probably the work that had the most impact on his universe, and he never hid it anyway. He grew up in a house where video games were not allowed. His favorite hobbies were reading novels like books in which you are the hero, as we have seen, but also Berserk manga in mind. Berserk is a manga created by the late Kentaro Miura, who died in 2022. It began its pre-publication in the Monthly Animal House in 1989 and tells a dark fantasy story where we will follow Guts, who is hunted all his life by demons, following the betrayal of a brother-in-arms who did not hesitate to sacrifice him and his other companions in order to rise to the rank of divinity. Berserk is a hard, visceral, shocking work, and not to be put in everyone's hands. Games from Hidetaka Miyazaki, Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring all take the path of dark fantasy, and references to Berserk are absolutely everywhere. In Dark Souls, the Knight Artorias is clearly a nod to Guts, from his disjointed, bestial fighting style to his pose in his official artwork. The skeleton wheel with its particular design can only be a reference to the manga. And while we're on the subject of bestiary, the Taurus demon we'll meet very early on in Dark Souls is Nosferatu Zod. The Red-Eye Orb is also a reference to the Behelit of Berserk, as is the blacksmith Andre from Dark Souls, who echoes the blacksmith Godo. In Sekiro now, the main character sports the same tuft of white hair as Guts with the same protasis of arms. Also, Wild ended up with a sword around his neck, similar to the Guardian Monkey in Sekiro. In Demon Souls, Boletaria's fog was surely inspired by the fog that covers the city of Wyndham. In both cases, his arrival was synonymous with the appearance of demons. By the way, it's quite funny to see that a descriptive passage of the city of Wyndham in Berserk fits perfectly with the description that could be made of the city of Yharnam in Bloodborne. The themes of pregnancy and birth recur in both Bloodborne and Berserk, like the mention of the moon, whether it's with the Moonchild in Berserk or the lunar presence in Bloodborne, a boss that will appear after collecting 3/3 of an umbilical cord. Elden Ring is no exception either, with the starting class prisoner, which is the perfect example and reminds us of Griffith's captivity with this mask covering his entire head. If we talk to you about Berserk, it's to tell you about the influences of Hidetaka Miyazaki in the broadest sense. It is undeniably the work that has most inspired all of his work, even if it is far from being the only one. For example, it is impossible not to see Lovecraft in the cosmic horror of Bloodborne. If there is one game that has marked Hidetaka Miyazaki, it is ICO. It is the first game of Fumito Ueda, to whom we owe Shadow of the Colossus and The Last Guardian. Ueda is one of those creators with a strong vision which perfectly embodies their game. He is to be placed in the same category as geniuses like Hideo Kojima and Yoko Taro, for example. These are creatives who are almost as well known as their work, which is rare enough to be highlighted in the video game industry, and it's quite funny to see that it's almost always Japanese. When a friend of Miyazaki's lends him ICO, it's a revelation. He puts his hands on a particular work that manages to touch his heart. The game tells the story of a young boy born with horns locked up in a fortress by the members of his village because of his difference. He meets Yorda, a young girl with supernatural abilities capable of moving blocks, for example. The game is punctuated by a succession of puzzles, and it will be a question of using Yorda's abilities while helping him to evolve in the maze of the fortress. In addition to offering a very innovative gameplay for the time, ICO presents cryptic passages, leaving room for the player's imagination. A feeling that will remind him of his years reading English fantasy novels, the passages of which he imagined that he did not understand. Miyazaki would admit it years later, ICO really changed his life. He literally fell in love with gaming and is now sure that he has to give up his job as an accountant to create video games. The problem is that we are talking about a young man in his 30s with only professional experience as an accountant. How do you get into a video game studio with such a small background? It's downright mission impossible, and he knows that. He still tries to leave his resume here and there, praying for a callback. He came up empty-handed until the day a studio finally contacted him again. FromSoftware. In 2004, FromSoftware is not the industry giant it is today. It is a small studio known for Armored Core and King's Field. These are their two flagship licenses, but it's far from a real big worldwide success. It was precisely in the context of the development of Armored Core Last Raven that FromSoftware hired him as a planner This position is the chance he has been waiting for. Hidetaka redoubles his efforts, becomes a force of proposal and initiative. His ideas are flowing, but they hardly match with an already well-established license like Armored Core. Despite this, he was quickly noticed by his superiors, so much so that in the space of only a short time, Miyazaki was given the role of Director of Development on Armored Core 4 and its sequel For Answer. Both games received very average reviews with 65 and 64 on Metacritic, and they are also among the lowest rated opuses of the series along with Last Raven, a game for which he was originally hired. But the young man is not discouraged. He has made his first steps and intends to capitalize on the responsibilities offered by FromSoftware. Armored Core's mechs are not really his style. We must not forget that what he likes is fantasy. And that's good because he will end up learning about a project that is stalling internally, a project that no one wants to take care of. You remember I told you earlier that Software was known mainly for two licenses at the time, Armored Core and King's Field. We saw the first one together, but King's Field, we haven't really talked about it yet. It is a role-playing game released on the first PlayStation, which almost accompanied the launch of Sony's console. It's dark fantasy in the first person, entirely in 3D, which was quite rare for the time. The game was a commercial success that resulted in several sequels between '94 and 2006. If we're talking about King's Field now, it's because the project that is bogged down at FromSoftware is seen internally as its spiritual heir. This project is Demon Souls. The game is slipping, the prototypes are not convincing, and it is on the verge of cancellation. Miyazaki heard about the project and offered to take it back to the studio. FromSoftware doesn't have much to lose given its advancement, and for Hidetaka, it's the perfect opportunity to let his creative genius run wild. He sees Demon Souls as a blank page on which he can finally express himself, and it's even the perfect project since we remember King's Field is dark fantasy. So he began his work on Demon Souls, the first draft of a recipe that would evolve again and again. The narration is cryptic, the characters mysterious, the atmosphere dark and creepy, the monsters overpowered, and death is an integral part of the experience. Demon Souls is demanding rough. It's the opposite of what was done at the time. When the open world began to become widespread with Assassin's Creed, Demon Souls chose a compartmentalized level accessible via a hub. When Naughty Dog continues with the narrative solo in Uncharted 2, no one understands anything about the story of Demon Souls. Overall, the productions are more and more dirigiste, and the tutorials omnipresent, everything that Miyazaki's formula will never be. Another thing that stood out at the time, the game was hard, and it was hard in all facets of its game design. No one understands anything about the evolution of the character or the scaling of weapons. The game integrates a weight system for your hero that will punctuate the speed of your rolls, and death is not only synonymous with returning to the last checkpoint. If you die a second time without having recovered your XP at the place of your first death, you would lose your souls, a valuable resource that serves as both experience to spend and currency to buy equipment or upgrade it. The game also features an amazing multiplayer mechanic. Players can leave marks on the ground visible to others in order to guide them. These are pre-constructed messages. Basically, you have a list of words that you can put together in order to communicate with others, and sometimes it's benevolent with the famous, watch ahead, to warn of an ambush, or sometimes totally trollish, inviting the most naive to jump into a hole, making it look like a secret passage. It has personally happened to me to be as naive as a 3-week-old rabbit. PvP is also implemented in a roundabout way via invasions. At any time in your game, if you're playing online and in soul form, a player can invade you. He will then appear in your level and hunt you down. A boss fight will even use this mechanic, since the confrontation opposing you against the old monk will be replaced by a fight against a player if you play online. Despite everything, Demon Souls will receive a timid reception at launch. Sales are not really there, and for good reason. The title seems hermetic. It's a little cold shower for our Miyazaki, who is starting to wonder if he did things right, but time passes and a small niche of players learns to tame this game that is so particular internationally. They understand Miyazaki's vision better than the Japanese at the time, a fresh, demanding vision, but just Demon Souls paved the way, and his next game will be recognized by all. He is convinced of it. After the mixed reception of Demon's Souls, FromSoftware entrusted a new project to Miyazaki. The studio feels something, and even if everything wasn't perfect on Demon's Souls, they feel like they're holding something. With Dark Souls, Miyazaki thinks much bigger, the lore becomes deeper and more complex. It is the opus that makes all the elements of the game design credible. If you can rise again at each of your deaths, it is because you are the bearer of the Dark Mark. In the game world, what prevents an undead from turning into a carcass is willpower. Once a living dead person loses all reason to live, he gradually loses his humanity. From then on, we can directly transpose the player's desire to complete his quest to justify his healthy mind in the game, even after hundreds of deaths. And to go even further, we can even imagine that the moment the player puts down his controller and rages out of the game, his avatar will turn into one of the many carcasses in the other player's game. The possibility of invading the game of others, of being invaded, or of seeing very briefly a player who evolves in the same area before disappearing is explained by Solar of Astora at the turn of a line of dialogue. The game justifies in its universe all its multiplayer aspect, but if we were talking about difficulties with Demon's Souls, Dark Souls undoubtedly raises the bar. The Demon Capra, accompanied by these two dogs in a tiny arena, will only be the beginning of the confrontation against not one, but two bosses with Ornstein and Smaug. Even access to the DLC, content that you have paid for, is a real headache that will not be indicated to you anywhere. The mere presence of mimicry in the game, monsters taking the appearance of treasure chests to fool adventurers, testifies to Miyazaki's deviousness. The game gets players used to collecting resources by searching chests before integrating them, so you get fooled the first time. Then you learn how to hit a chest before opening it later. Marketing also plays on the difficulty by naming one of its additions Prepare to Die. The tone is set, and his insurmountable game aspect becomes an element of communication that will sometimes play tricks on him. But Dark Souls is above all a level design acclaimed by absolutely everyone, often imitated but never equaled. The zones are all connected to each other, so that teleportation is not unlocked until quite late in the game. The campfires, synonymous with a checkpoint to breathe a little, are the ultimate reward of an exploration once again complicated. Illusory walls already present in Demon's Souls are making a comeback. It is roughly a fake wall, an illusion which hides a secret room. There are more of them, and they fit perfectly into the level design, so much so that players who have experienced them for the first time often start to hit absolutely all the walls, hoping to discover a new one. With Dark Soul, Miyazaki has traveled, especially in Europe, and has visited many cultural places that will serve as the setting for the game's Gothic building. The Cathedral of Milan was used as a base for Honor Lando's plans. The double staircase of the Chateau de Chambord is reproduced almost identically in the same city. Miyazaki also admitted in an interview that the ruins of the new Lundo were taken from Mont Saint-Michel. Asia is not to be outdone, especially with the Izalith area, a den of demons. It is directly taken from the temples of Angkor in Cambodia, and having been lucky enough to have been there after playing the game, it is true that it is obvious. South America also played a role with the Mexican mines of Naica and its enormous crystals. The obvious reference in the game is, of course, the Crystal Cave, Seath's landmark. As you can see, Miyazaki integrates reality into his myth, enriching the cultural degree of his work. It doesn't take hold with everyone, but his work undeniably takes credit. Today, Dark Souls is undeniably a game changer that has brought a lot to the industry. It is not for nothing that it has given birth to a subgenre that tries to take up the formula with the Souls-like. The success is proven, and it is clearly one of the most influential games of recent years. Miyazaki's genius is finally recognized by the whole world after Dark Souls. The success is total. First place in sales in Japan at launch, more than 2.3 million sales in 1 year and a half, 89 Metacritic score. A sequel is naturally quickly envisaged, but in a dramatic turn of events, Miyazaki detached himself from the project, too busy on a new license that will come later. He was content with the role of supervisor on Dark Souls 2 and took the opportunity to take over the studio that same year following the acquisition by Kadokawa. The project was entrusted to another team. The vision of the new director, Tomohiro Shibuya, was a photorealistic open-world sequel But the project did not please, as the console architectures of the time were too small for such a great ambition. The reboot came naturally, and the baby was entrusted to Yui Tanimura. Dark Souls 2 was released in March 2014. The game was highly anticipated, and sales did not disappoint. However, the difficulty, previously rather well managed and quite fair in the first part, seems to make you cringe this time. According to some journalists, the game is too hard to be really appreciated. Dark Souls 2 is divisive. It is often seen as a good game, but as a bad Dark Souls. In the community, either we love it or we hate it. For many, the absence of Miyazaki at the controls is felt. The game is pointed out for its sometimes inconsistent difficulty with an overload of opponents on the screen. The level design is not as good as the first part, and the lore seems sloppy. Where the Dark Souls 1 was exciting and had theoretically occupied fans on the forums for years, the recipe for this new opus takes much less. A new version of the game, Scholar of the First Sin, was announced very early on by FromSoftware. It brings remastered visuals, detailed lighting, and makes the technique great at 1080p 60 FPS on PC, PS4, and Xbox One. Changes are also made directly in the game, whether on the addition of new enemies or directly on their location. Dark Souls 2 is a half-successful sequel, and some fans of the license will advise you to go from 1 to 3. The game is, however, appreciated by Miyazaki, who said very recently in an interview for IGN that the title had its share of good ideas and that without it, there probably wouldn't have been Elden Ring. It's the opus that does things differently. It doesn't make it a bad game, and the best advice I can give you is to make up your own mind. If Miyazaki only had a supervisor role on Dark Souls 2, it is because he was preparing his brand new license for the PlayStation 4, Bloodborne. With Bloodborne, Hidetaka explores Lovecraft's universe and abandons the fallen fantasy worlds full of desolation. Bloodborne places the player in a Victorian-inspired environment centered on Lovecraft's own horror and cosmic themes. You play as a hunter who must purge the city of Yharnam, a direct reference to the city of Arkham in Lovecraft's writings. Yes, I know, when I say Arkham you think of Batman, but it's above all an imaginary city widely mentioned in Lovecraft's work. The recipe also evolves in its gameplay, where the confrontations of Demon Souls and Dark Souls were punctuated by caution through observation. Bloodborne integrates a more aggressive and faster game system. The shield is replaced by a firearm, and it will be more a question of finding the right window during enemy attacks to trigger a perfect riposte and follow up with a powerful blow. The game system favors attacking, with the possibility of recovering some of the life points lost after taking a hit. It's a banal addition, but it changes a lot of things. The last novelty in the gameplay, and which will be taken up later via the weapon art and Ashes of War, is the transformation of weapons. Bloodborne has chosen to offer a more limited number of weapons than in the old games, but which allows for gameplay evolutions through their transformation. Precise Strokes is fast in its first form, but gains in length once transformed. Nothing prevents the player from starting his combo with his initial form and then transforming it between 2 hits. The confrontations are then better paced, for a deeper gameplay. The last ingredient that will be found in the Elden Ring recipe is the Chalice dungeons. It's impossible not to see a first draft of what will simply be called a dungeon in FromSoftware's latest game, and scattered absolutely everywhere in the open world. These dungeons are usually preceded by a small puzzle asking you to find a lever that opens the door leading to the boss. Bloodborne is considered by many to be their favorite FromSoftware games. Peaking at 92 on Metacritic, it denotes quite a lot with the previous productions. 4 years have passed since Dark Souls 2, and in March 2016, Dark Souls 3 finally arrives, marking the return of Hidetaka Miyazaki to the franchise. FromSoftware knows that Dark Souls 2 should have done better and does not want to take any risks to complete the trilogy. Dark Souls 3 is an almost direct sequel to the first one, as the references are legion, characters from the original opus are directly cited, the city of Anor Londo is squarely present in the game, and overall it is the very essence of the Dark Souls mythology that is treated with explanations on the nature of the Dark Soul. Dark Souls 3 is the apotheosis of the saga. It does better everywhere. Except, of course, on the level design, the first game remains unbeatable even today. The gameplay seems to be a perfect fusion between the strategic and calculating aspect of Dark Souls and the nervousness of Bloodborne's clashes. The fights are more fluid and dynamic, the game less frustrating, but Dark Souls 3 is also side quests that take a huge step forward. They are more numerous, the characters seem more involved and better written, the plots of the secondary characters will evolve as you progress. The duo Henri and Horus alone symbolize this progression in the writing, offering you both a heartbreaking denouement, a secret ending, and access to an optional area. If the second game was truly separate in the lore of the trilogy, Dark Souls 3 will take you back to well-known areas such as Anor Londo, and develop iconic characters from the first installment, such as Guinevere, in a much more believable way than Dark Souls 2 did. The case of the Nameless King is the perfect example. It's an optional boss that is actually the first of the god Gwyn. His identity is never directly revealed in the game, but if you pay attention to the details, there is no longer any doubt. All this to tell you that Dark Souls 3 represents, in my opinion, the pinnacle of the development of the lore by FromSoftware. By revealing the very nature of the Dark Soul, Miyazaki puts a perfect end to a trilogy that can reopen at any time when we know the existence of the worlds painted in the game, as a way to close a universe which, as we know, continues with or without Dark Souls 4. The success of Dark Souls 3 is undeniable, despite everything Miyazaki does not want to lock himself in his flagship saga. After Bloodborne in 2015, the creative is back with a new license, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. FromSoftware uses its flagship formula, a cryptic lore although more scripted, demanding confrontations, checkpoints rare enough to let you breathe a sigh of relief when you discover them, a particular care given to the level design, and above all, failure as a game mechanic. Even though Sekiro is probably the least like FromSoftware's opus of the others, there is no doubt that it is a baby of the studio. The one who will offer the first game title of the year to FromSoftware has brought the final ingredient to Elden Ring, verticality. The protagonist of the game, the Wolf, alone justifies this verticality by his ninja nature. As we know, in the common imagination, a ninja is fast, agile, and stealthy. Our character has a grappling hook that he can use to get to the rooftops and move faster. In addition to making exploration much more enjoyable, it is often thanks to verticality that we will be able to approach our targets stealthily, a mechanic that we will find later in Elden Ring. It is important to point out that in Demon Souls, the 3 Dark Souls, and Bloodborne, at no time was it possible to enter stealth mode by crouching. It's a mechanic that came with Sekiro, and similarly, none of the previous games offered a jump button. The skipped roll in the previous games doesn't count, and its presence at the expense of a simple jump button reflected the studio's desire to limit the player's movements to bring out all the spice of a level design that can be explored on foot, and where verticality is only approached through ladders or mechanisms. We literally kept our feet on the ground before Sekiro. This verticality has clearly been taken up in Elden Ring. The character can jump naturally, columns of air propel the player directly, and are steed tens of meters above the ground. And Torrent, the horse, has a double jump. The multiplication of approaches stems indirectly from stealth and verticality, giving players the choice to keep a low profile to maximize kills before engaging in head-on combat isn't possible without a stealth mechanic. And the verticality offered by Sekiro favors stealth. It's also a great way to get around a difficulty naturally. FromSoftware will continue to give players a choice with Elden Ring, and Spirit Ash summons will become the ultimate weapon that indirectly redefines your difficulty mode. Use them to make your battles easier, or play without them. On February 25th, 2022, 3 years after its announcement at E3 2019, Elden Ring finally arrives, the culmination of a vision that, with its 6 previous games, has been able to keep the best of everyone. Elden Ring is a UFO, the game is gigantic, the exploration never stops. You often get lost, and I caught myself whispering this famous "really?" several times after the discovery of yet another secondary zone within a secondary zone. Elden Ring is huge on too many points. Weapons, builds, stuff, stuff, magics, bosses, areas, plots. It even managed to annoy some developers of the biggest video game companies, frustrated by an overly refined interface, which managed to suggest everything without ever showing anything directly. But the real stroke of genius is that FromSoftware has managed to open up a new audience without giving in to the requests for difficulty modes requested by some players. Miyazaki stuck to his vision, and that's rare in the industry. Miyazaki's latest work will destroy everything in its path, making the headlines for months. True legends will be born thanks to Elden Ring, including the famous Let Me Solo Her. Dozens of content creators will try to complete the game in the most absurd way possible, for example by playing with saxophone, by voice control, with a single Morse code button, or simply with its brain activity without touching any controller. 2 years later, the game, which in the meantime has obviously become the game of the year 2022, will sell 23 million units. It took him only 3 weeks to explode the 10 million sales of Dark Souls 3 ahead of the studio's horns and reach 12 million. Elden Ring has undeniably taken the studio to a whole new dimension, and if it can't wait for its next game, the whole world has already relaunched itself into the adventure thanks to its DLC Shadow of the Erdtree. Thank you so much for following this episode of Digital Tales on the 10 milestones that led to the creation of Elden Ring. It's a bit long, but there was so much to say that I unfortunately couldn't do otherwise. And I must admit that FromSoftware is a studio that I particularly like, and I am really proud to have written this video. Don't hesitate to give me your feedback in the comments. I promise I'll read everything. As for me, it's time to say goodbye. Kisses to all, and see you soon.